This week, week 7, we are going to look at Chapter 18, Experimental and Quasi-Experimental Research. There's some terminology that we need to know up front. One of the terminologies that kind of gets used, they're equivalent or equal words, is experiment, treatment, and intervention. Those three words mean the same thing. Again, experiment, treatment, intervention, all those things mean the experiment that we're doing. We're trying to determine if we do something as an experiment, does that experiment cause an effect? And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But just so you know, the words experiment, treatment, intervention, and if I think of another one while I'm in the middle of the presentation, I'll let you know that. Other things, some terminology that I need to make sure that you're aware of is the terms experimental group or groups and control group. An experimental group is the group that, or groups that can actually receive the treatment, the experiment. The control group is the group of individuals that aren't going to go through the experiment at all. They're the group that we use to determine if that experiment actually made a difference. And just so you know, a group is the total number of people in the experimental or independent variable group. So a group can be a certain number of individuals. We try to keep all our groups the same number. So if we had an experimental group of 15, we'd want a control group of 15. So hopefully some of these terms will be clear, because we'll be using this terminology throughout the podcast or the lecture. So with that in mind, our objectives for this lecture are to define the uses for experimental designs in our research. We want to discuss the procedures used in experimental research. You need to understand what internal and external validity and what are the threats to internal and external validity in our experimental research. And we're going to talk about the different types of experimental designs. We're going to talk about the steps in conducting experimental research. And how do we evaluate experimental research? So that's our objectives for this lecture. Just so you know, the textbook does a really good job of describing that for us to use, one of the reasons why we use experimental design is to determine a cause and effect. And what we mean by cause and effect is we want to determine if the independent variable has an effect on the dependent variable. And we've talked about the independent variables and the dependent variables in the past, and we're going to talk about that through this lecture. We want to make sure that the independent variable causes some kind of change or has an effect on the dependent variable. But in order for us to determine cause and effect, we have to meet these three criteria that the book describes. The first one is the cause must precede the effect in time. So you can't have the effect happen before the cause. And the textbook talks about in track, we have everybody lined up to get ready to run, and they shoot the gun and everybody runs. Well, the cause for the running would be the shooting of the gun, and the effect is the people running. We can't have the people running before the gun goes off. So the cause, which is the gun, must precede the effect in time. So we can't have the change before the experiment. So that's basically all that's talking about there. The cause and effects must be correlated with one another. We've talked about correlational statistics, where smoking does not cause cancer, smoking is related to cancer, but smoking does not cause cancer. Those two variables are related to each other, and they have to have some kind of interaction with one another. And same with when we do an experiment, the two variables have to have some kind of relationship to one another. It doesn't make sense to try to determine if A affects B unless A and B are related to one another. Who cares if they're not related to one another? Who cares if there's not an interaction between each other with that? The third criteria for cause and effect is the correlation between cause and effect cannot be explained by another variable. When we set up an experimental design, what we're trying to determine is that variable, whatever that variable is, actually caused the other variable, the other action, the change, whatever it is. And we try to eliminate all other variables that can cause the explanation of the change or the effect. And in previous learning activities, I've had you describe or list your delimitations. And what those delimitations are is, again, those individuals that you're going to say who are in your study. And the reason why we do that, because some of those things may be the other causes. It can be the other effects or the problem. As it says down there at the bottom of the slide, if the condition is necessary and sufficient to produce the effect, then it is the cause. That's what we're trying to find in the end. So experimental research tries to establish the cause and effect, and how we do that is by these steps here. As we have we make a selection of good theoretical framework, which means we have good ideals. We use our literature review to come up with good theory. Then from that theory we design appropriate experiment to actually determine if the independent variable has an effect on a dependent variable. We control a lot of things that can have a negative effect or an effect that we don't want on our in our study. So we have a good theoretical framework. We have application of appropriate experimental designs. We use the correct statistical methods to analyze our data, because the wrong statistics will give us wrong information. We have proper selection and control of our independent variables. So we select the right independent variables and then we control them appropriately. So we are making sure that the independent variable is actually doing what it's supposed to do. Then we have appropriate selection and measurement of our dependent variables. Last week in survey research, I spent some time talking about validity and reliability. I believe chapter 11 in the textbook also talked about that. So we want to make sure that we select the appropriate dependent variables. Again, dependent variables are the things we actually measure. So is it valid and reliable way to determine if there's been an effect which was caused by our independent variable? And then do we make the correct interpretation of the results? That's critical. Do we really interpret what the results told us? Because some people can not do that, and we have inappropriate results. And I want to review a few important terms. This is back from chapter 3, but I've already said these a few times, but I want to make sure that we're perfectly clear on these. Independent variable. Those are the variables. Again, a variable can be weightlifting, so that's very broad. It's a variable that is manipulated or changed, is another way of thinking of it, manipulated or changed by the researcher. So if you are conducting an experimental design for your project or study. It's those things that you try to change. And we'll give an example of some independent variables. We've used them in the past. And the dependent variable is the effect of the independent variable. Now, the easiest way to think of the dependent variable is the thing that's actually being measured. Heart rate, the fitness level would be determined by heart rate. The VO2 max is determined by heart rate, or can be weight gain, weight loss, vertical jump and measured in the power. So those are the different things that you're actually measuring. Categorical variables are factors that cannot be changed or manipulated. For example, gender. You can't change the gender. And so that's what a categorical variable is. A control variable is the independent variable that could influence the results. It can have a negative influence on what you're trying to do. And the big one here is the extraneous variable. These are factors that could affect a relationship between an independent variable and a dependent variable. What we try to do when we set up our research study, our experimental design study, is we try to control those extraneous variables. Anything that can really change the effect that the independent variable has on a dependent variable. We either identify those early in our limitations part of our chapter 1 and say these things can actually affect the outcome. These things can affect the real cause and effect between the independent variable and the dependent variable. We identify those and try to control for those, which means get rid of them somehow. Statistically, we can remove those, but I'm not going to get into that in this lecture. So we just need to be able to identify some of those variables that can have an effect on the independent variable and the dependent variable, and that relationship between them.